I declare the 11th emergency special session of the General Assembly resumed. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/L4.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates. Good morning, everyone. One early morning of April 1993, delegates to the United Nations had coffee, kissed their loved ones, and went to the quiet and comfortable United Nations headquarters to do business as usual. Perhaps as many of us have done this very morning. The same morning in early April 1993, Boutros Boutros-Ghali sent a special rapporteur to report on extrajudicial summary arbitrary executions in Rwanda. He reported a more robust United Nations response was needed. Critically, it found that the abuses could be precursors to genocide in 1993. Unfortunately, that was largely ignored by overstretched Secretariat of the United Nations. In early April, once again in April, in 1994, in the comfort of the United Nations headquarters, the Security Council received letters in which the Rwandan Patriotic Front reminded member states that, I quote, "When the institution of the United Nations was created after the Second World War, one of its fundamental objectives was to see to it that what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany would never happen again." End of quote. In 1994, Rwanda itself was a non-permanent member of the Security Council. This allowed the genocidal regime to influence other members of the Council with its view of the situation. As Russia's presence today in the Security Council allows her to spread lies almost daily. In April, again in April, this time 2006, in the docks of New York by the Hudson River, an ocean-sized, state-of-the-art liner was launched. This magnificent liner was then docked on the shores of Lake Geneva. Beautiful as it is, far from being an ocean. We named this liner the Human Rights Council. The adoption of Resolution 60/251 was a culmination of 5 months of consultations and negotiations facilitated by President of the Assembly, Jan Eliasson, and Ambassador Arias of Panama and Ambassador Kumalo of South Africa. Let me remind you the words of Mr. Jan Eliasson, the President of the 60th session of the UN General Assembly, before the adoption of the resolution. He said, and I quote, we have now reached a decisive moment, both for the promotion and protection of human rights and for effective multilateralism and the standing of the United Nations as a whole. As our leaders acknowledged in September 2005, the three pillars of the United Nations: development, peace and security, and human rights, are interlinked and mutually reinforcing. End of quote. Now the world has come to a crucial juncture. We witness that our liner is going through treacherous fogs towards deadly icebergs. It might seem that we should have named it the Titanic instead of the Human Rights Council. If not, we need to take an action today to save the Council from sinking. The composition of the Human Rights Council is as diverse as the world map, as this Assembly is. But this Council, unlike the Assembly, has been established for a specific purpose: to promote and protect human rights around the world. And we are in a unique situation now when on the territory of another sovereign state, a member of the Human Rights Council commits horrific human rights violations and abuses that could be equated to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Bucha and dozens of other Ukrainian cities and villages, where thousands of peaceful residents have been killed, tortured, raped, abducted, and robbed by the Russian army, serve as an example of how dramatically far the Russian Federation has gone from its initial declarations in the human rights domain. That is why this case is unique, and today's response is obvious and self-explanatory. Let me offer you another quote. Our topmost priority is to ensure all human rights and freedoms in their entirety, including political and civil rights and decent socio-economic and environmental living standards. I believe that these questions are not an internal matter of states, but rather their obligations under the UN Charter, the international covenants and conventions. We want to see this approach become a universal norm. End of quote. It is hard to believe that the above quotation belongs to the President of the Russian Federation. Another president, however, and other times. It was said by President Yeltsin in 1992 in his statement at the UN Security Council. We can only regret that the democratic aspirations of the peoples of Russia in early 90s have by Putin's regime been incrementally turned to their opposite. Aggression, hatred, and Soviet-style thinking and reflections, including in the area of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And now we hear completely different statements here in the United Nations from the Russian Federation. This week alone, we hear from the Russian ambassador that there is a warfare in Ukraine and civilians are killed in war. It's being said, as a matter of fact, this Monday, in cold blood and as an absolute normal course of action, also known as quote-unquote special operation. Shall we agree with the describing of killings as something normal? The only healthy answer should be no, in order to contribute to the maintenance of the UN's health and the health of its human rights mechanism. All of you received the Russian diplomatic note yesterday, in which our collective effort to preserve the credibility of the Human Rights Council was considered as an approach to preserve the, I quote, domination and total control in the world, end of quote. And human rights neo-colonial policy in international affairs. We have heard many times the same perverted logic of the aggressor attempting to present itself as a victim, while in fact doing exactly what it cries against in its note, killing citizens of neighboring country, trying to dominate, if it not colonize it. In reply to that, we call on Russia, when its rights of membership in the Human Rights Council are suspended, to return to responsible behavior by implementing the decisions of this Assembly and of Human Rights Council. If Russia expulses itself from the Council, it would be its own choice, and there will be no need to blame others. Suspension of the rights of membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council is not an option, but a duty. And let me quote how this duty is formulated in the operative paragraph 8 of Resolution 60/251, and I quote, "The General Assembly may suspend the rights of membership in the Council of a member of the Council that commits gross and systematic violations of human rights," end of quote. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's not an option, it is what the resolution prescribes. We view voting to suspend a state's Human Rights Council rights as a rare and extraordinary action. However, Russia's actions are beyond the pale. Russia is not only committing human rights violations, it is shaking the underpinnings of international peace and security. A draft resolution on the matter under A/ES 11/L4 is a result of the collective effort of a cross-regional group of 24 states that represent all regions. It has been co-sponsored so far by more than 50 UN member states. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft. Let me now once again refer to the commemoration of one of the darkest pages in recent history, the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. On this day of grievances and bearing its own tragedy of thousands of Ukrainians killed by the Russian invaders, Ukraine stands together with Rwanda and calls to reaffirm our pledge to never forget and to never allow the recurrence of genocide, which was a result of the international community's indifference. To those of you who, for this or another reason, opts today to keep being a bystander, to abstain, let me quote Elie Wiesel addressing President Clinton in 1999, talking about the perils of indifference. Indifference elicits no response. Indifference is not a response. Indifference is not a beginning, it is an end. And therefore, indifference is always the friend of the enemy, for it benefits the aggressor, never his victim, whose pain is magnified when he or she feels forgotten. The political prisoner in his cell, the hungry children, the homeless refugees, not to respond to their plight, not to relieve their solitude by offering them a spark of hope, is to exile them from human memory. And in denying their humanity, we betray our own. End of quote. The genocide in Rwanda was largely due to the indifference of the world's community. When the UN did not respond to warnings in the UN Security Council and in General Assembly a year before the tragedy that we commemorate exactly on this day, on the 7th of April. Today, in the case of Ukraine, it's not even a year, because the tragedy is unfolding right now before our eyes. In a couple of minutes, you will have a chance to prove that you are not an indifferent bystander. All you need to do is to press the yes button and to save the Human Rights Council and many lives around the world and in Ukraine. On the other hand, pressing no means pulling a trigger and means a red dot on the screen. Red as the blood of the innocent lives lost. And this image of the red bloody dots on this screen will stay with you and all of us as long as memory does not fail us. Think about it. Thank you.
A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-11/L4, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-11/L4, entitled Suspension of the Rights of Membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 93, against, 24, abstentions, 58. Draft resolution A/ES-11/L4 is adopted.